Hello, my name is Woody. This is Change in the House of Pods, a podcast about Deftones. My guest today is Dave Park, Deftones' first manager. Dave was instrumental in their rise to becoming professionals, an active and influential participant in their development. His work with the band included everything from booking gigs and working out a live show to cutting demos and eventually signing to Maverick. For my money, if somebody discovered Deftones, it was Dave. I mean, if Madonna wants to stake that claim, she can come and discuss it with me. But without Dave, I'm not sure who opens the doors for Deftones in the music business. He had the know-how and the network, and his experience managing a band prior to Deftones was crucial to their success. And it was how Dave met Steph.
I, once upon a time, in a previous life, I was an up-and-coming artist manager in Sacramento. And Stefan actually worked as a guitar tech. People would think of as a roadie, basically, but as a guitar tech for the lead guitar player, my main client, a band called FMK. And it's noteworthy that this particular guitar player that Stefan worked for was a monster talent, a guy named Mike Farrell. One of these monster talents that, is super noteworthy locally and regionally, but doesn't become the sort of national name that everyone would have expected. It's just, kind of the way that life works. But while that band ultimately sort of broke up, like right around the time they were about to get signed, Stefan had a front row seat to all the adulation that band got. And the attention that Mike got as the guitar player, and he was like a sponge. Steph would ride with me to rehearsals and shows, and was constantly asking questions. How did I parlay these small shows into bigger shows? And, why was I coaching the band in the ways that I did? And, Steph saw how much thought I put into the job, how much I cared. And so the way that I actually came to first hear the name Deftones, and this is a true story, this is going to sound like mythology, but he literally told me many, many times, over a dozen times, Dave, I'm going to start a band. I'm going to name it Deftones. You're going to be our manager, and we're going to be world famous. And it sounds ridiculous to say this now, but it's not a joke. I mean, he really did do that.
Can you tell me about when this was?
So that's a band that he was working with us from 88 to 90, beginning of 91, and there was some overlap. So the way that I came to be involved, with them is, he would, on these rides, he would occasionally bring these boombox tapes, as he was, he would cajole people into coming to jam with him in his mom's garage or occasionally over, in somebody's bedroom. The earliest incarnations of what became like sort of the first iteration of Deftones. And he would take these boom boxes and, you could set them up to record through the condenser mic on there. And he would play me these horrible boombox tapes that were just, recordings of their rehearsals. And they're just, sort of random noodling. And I mean, it was just mostly really awful stuff. But this happened a few times until one day, as the story goes, one day we were on our way we were in my truck on our way to something, I don't know if a rehearsal or a show or something, but Stefan was right with me and he said, "Hey, I got another tape." And I'm like, all right. And I would just sort of humor him, right? Because he was a hard worker, and he was paying attention. He asked good questions. All right, so I didn't want to discourage him, but the tapes were really hard to listen to. But anyhow, he was playing this, another rehearsal tape, trying to get me interested and looking for feedback or, whatever commentary I might offer. And it was mostly unlistenable, shit, pardon my language. But then there was this one song that came on. And the song wasn't great and the arrangement wasn't really great, but there was this one part of this song, and it was a song called Some People. And I don't know if you find, images online of the different demos, this literally ended up becoming the first song on the very first sort of semi-official demo that the band ever cut. But there was, I didn't know any of the names of the guys in the band, but the singer, Chino, was doing this sort of droning rap in a style that I had never heard before. And it was really clever, the sort of, the cadence to it. And it really stood out because, in part because it was surrounded by such, shall we say, not yet fully formed musical ideas. And sometimes young bands, this will happen. Sometimes young bands will have moments of brilliance where they accidentally do something cool. And, I wasn't really sure if this was like a one-time thing, just a fluke, or if there was more merit, if there were other songs, other ideas. And Stefan eventually talked me into going out to see a show, and they had like one of their first gigs was a show at this place called the Guild Theater in 1990. And the set was not great, and they were violating, all of the rules of what to do as a live band. The singer had his back to the audience most of the set. No real sort of cohesive sort of stage presence, but as it turns out, there were actually 3 songs. There was, that moment in that one sort of verse in repeating verse in Some People, and then there were moments in a couple of other songs that I heard. And so that was the sort of origin of my interest in the band.
Can you tell me sort of what led you to that point, and where your background in management to that point, and how you sort of came to be in that position that would eventually lead you to connect with Steph?
Sure. So, well, that band that Stefan and I both worked for was, somewhat noteworthy locally and regionally at the time. And a lot of what I learned and instilled in the band and what they learned, were really lessons from the mistakes of that band and other bands, how to be, effective at developing a fan base and the importance of touring and getting outside your comfort zone, playing in front of strangers, and becoming a student of human behavior, watching the crowd, paying attention, not just to what songs, people clap the loudest for, but what moments of songs they seem to be most engaged in. And so a lot of those conversations that Stefan and I had, hundreds of conversations, over the years, were, just sort of the byproduct of the experience that we were having sort of in real time, working that band and the different, trials and tribulations and challenges, and then turning around. And I think just in life, obviously we hopefully, if we're paying attention, mostly get to learn from the mistakes of others, so that we don't have to fall in those same footsteps ourselves.
Wow. It's so interesting to me to think about this time before, when they were cutting their teeth, and was it just those moments that caught your attention? Was it just those moments that made you decide, yeah, I'll take these guys on or give them a shot? Or can you give me some more description of like what you saw,
Sure.
What you assessed?
Well, these were, you have to understand, these were, for the most part, kids, dysfunctional kids from dysfunctional homes, some of them broken homes, who didn't really have anything else going on, in their lives. And so it was, part of it is, my whole thing as a manager in those days was seeing myself in a way as sort of like like a one-man army, the antidote to injustice. There's so many great bands and great songs that fall through the cracks for different reasons. And being in radio, you probably saw this
Totally.
all the time.
Still, yeah.
And it's just, there are all of these different gauntlets. You can do everything right, and for want of a nail, you fall through a crack. And so it was a really big deal to me to find those great bands, the bands that were willing to put in the time, and be relentless and keep working and push through the pain, and believe in each other, and find a goal that was bigger than themselves. And they were hungry, and maybe not on day one, but pretty quickly, they found there was something, like there was a common goal that was like the bright red thread between all of them, that they were willing to do what was necessary and to put the work in.
How did you come to manage? How did you come to be managing bands at that time?
So this is probably not quite as interesting, but so I started out as a guitar player. I mean, just like everybody else. I mean,
Sure.
I grew up in a musical household. My dad was a guitar player. And so his dobro was sort of like the soundtrack to my childhood. And I developed a style of playing that modeled my dad, who was modeling a guy named Leo Kottke. I don't know how many of your listeners are going to know that name, but I didn't even realize that there were other people who played like that. It was just, this is how my dad plays, and I thought that's how a guitar is supposed to be played. And so that's how I play. And it turns out that was a different style than a lot of the other kids that I grew up with. And so, they embraced me as having a different style than them. I was the kid that stood out. And so I fell into a group of friends, and in that group of friends was this guy, Mike Farrell, who went on to be, the sort of kingpin of this band that was formidable, on the local scene back then. And everybody once upon a time, would have sworn a blood oath that this kid, Mike Farrell, was going to be the next Eddie Van Halen. I mean, He's just a monster talent.
This is not the first time that he's come up on this podcast. Tell me again the name of the band.
FMK.
FMK. But there was another, wasn't there? Wasn't there another band that maybe I'm just mistaken in my recollection? Please go ahead.
I was just going to say FMK was, sort of a terrible name for a much better band, but they changed it to. It was originally the initials of the three original members of the bands. But they changed it to mean Fat Molly's Kitchen. So I don't know if that's the name, or if it's yet a different name. You were talking about, or was it Fallacy was the other name? Is that?
Well, Fallacy has certainly come up on this, but I'm wondering, was Steph playing for FMK at any point, or was he just teching or roadieing?
He was a tech, and for a young kid who was sort of in his first kind of gig, he just sort of threw himself at it, and he did lots of little extra things. I mean, there's lots of people who want to be in the orbit of a band, right? There's a sort of halo effect. Any band at any level that's kind of getting attention and, attracting some notoriety, or girls, or both, has a sort of gravitational pull, on people. There are obviously communities that develop around those bands. So there were other people, that were roadies or techs, but Stefan sort of distinguished himself because he did little extra things. He wouldn't just restring a guitar, he'd polish it. This is for a local band. He would be careful and very deliberate about straightening out chords and duct taping paths to the stage, and little things that I didn't even have to tell him. He would just see it being done and know that, this is how it should be done.
That's really cool. I've heard different things about Steph and his early life. A lot of the story is about the accident and how that, granted him a whole slew of equipment. I've heard how he worked in a restaurant,
time.
but this sort, but
yeah, and time.
yeah.
So
was that prior to meeting you or after?
He, the accident was prior, but
Okay.
what was happening was, as he was rehabbing from, being hit by the car,
Right.
and he got some money, put some, an initial set of gear together. He would spend hours just noodling, either on his mom's porch or in his mom's garage, just, practicing relentlessly. So, if you're a student of, Gladwell's whole thing about 10,000 hours,
Sure.
he was putting the time in, and mastering his instrument.
And yet he won't play a solo. It's so funny. And that's a tangent.
So there were a couple of early songs where he had very sort of safe, more almost more playing like harmonic counterpoints to the riffs, but there were a couple of solos early on, and they were credible. I mean, but he was approaching not so much like, I want a moment in the spotlight here, dig me. It was more like looking for extra layers that he could elevate the song in those places. So I look back at those as being efforts that he was making as a developing songwriter.
That's really fascinating. That's really cool to think about and to hear about. So tell me what happened. You went to this performance and you heard a few things.
Right.
What happens from there?
So a lot of just sort of, testing the guys, to see, are you going to be worth it if I commit myself to this and I try to help? Because I feel like at that moment, FMK literally broke up with record companies calling me to schedule showcases or to find out when the band was playing so that they could, jump on a plane and come see the band, because the band had been finding their legs, and we were developing a fan base. We were headlining in, other markets outside of Sacramento. And again, this was like the same sort of marketing strategy that I ended up being able to sort of spread my wings more for with Deftones. Were things that I had been doing and that Stefan had seen me do for this earlier band, FMK. And I think that was one of the things, like, if we had a chance and Dave was able to do these things for us, we wouldn't fuck it up the way that this other band did.
Word.
With, girls and proclivities and drug habits and, things.
They understood the value of it right away because they were witnessing it firsthand. Steph in particular was witnessing it firsthand. Yeah.
But so I mean, there were moments where they doubted themselves. They sort of got a taste of like, wow, there's a lot of work here. Chino in particular, started with very little confidence, and he wasn't super receptive when I was first trying to tell him, like, look, dude, you cannot turn your back on the audience. It's like there are certain rules, that you have to ascribe to, and ways that you can reach people. And one of the most fundamental is eye contact. When you look at people, you can't see them as wallpaper. You have to connect with them and let them connect with you and be authentic and be vulnerable. That sort of humanity is the fabric of how fan bases are built. If there's a mistake or you sing something wrong or, whatever, the beginning of every verse is a brand new verse. If you follow the beat, if you fuck up on the 4, you start over on the 1, and you have to, sort of learn to gather yourself in the middle of a song sometimes. And
he bristled to some of your suggestions, huh?
Yeah, well, he grew it, and obviously other guys in the band are seeing it and going, "Oh yeah, now that you mention it, maybe you should look at the audience."
Yeah,
now that you mention it, maybe you should make eye contact. But this was around the time, you know, and obviously Chino's like, well, it can't be all on me. I mean, you guys have to help. And so, you know, he was like, one of the things that he was sort of anxious about were those moments between songs where he's like, you know, he was so fully physically committed to the song that like he really felt like he needed a minute to sort of catch his breath. And I'm like, he said, well, someone else needs to step up and say something to the audience. And so that's actually where the original bass player, Chi, you know, where his role and his sense of humor kind of came into the picture, because Chino was like, you know, not quite comfortable being the front man and the center of attention, you know, every minute on stage. And so he was looking for help and support. And she was like, sure, you know, I'm a 6 foot tall Chinese dude with dreads. You know, let me step up and say some stupid shit. You know, we'll kill the time. And I mean, in the moment, we were like, "Oh God, you know, what are we asking? What could possibly go wrong?" But it worked. And you know, Chi wasn't like super comfortable either, but he knew that he kind of had to step up for his brother. You know, who just sort of needed to get over this bridge. You know, this stage of evolution or whatever it was. But as it turns out, you know, as serious and intense and sometimes dark as the band was in those days, this was sort of the beginning of them finding a sense of humor, and that this, you know, sort of awkwardness and dichotomy was actually a way of connecting with the audience. And the audience, it helped the audience sort of like break the ice that, like, you know, the band would play something super intense and then Chi would step up and just say, you know, I chipped a tooth this morning. I don't know if you noticed. So it was, you know, it was sort of great. And it was authentic. And, you know, I think that's a big part of what matters.
Totally. Was it long that they had been like, you said you probably saw them one of their first few shows was that show that you caught, right?
Yeah, it was. I don't know that they had. I think there were a couple of shows sort of informal prior to that, but that was one of the first shows where things started, where they really started to sort of see themselves as a band, rather than, you know, four guys who happen to be in the same place and, you know, happen to sort of loosely know some of the same songs. Where there was a, you know, us against the world kind of thing, very, very formatively, you know, potentially there. And, you know, these moments in these, remember, I said there were just a couple of songs and like moments in these songs. It wasn't just me who was paying attention and noticing these moments in these songs, because it was evident even in those very early days that when those moments came around in the songs, people in the audience, you know, like it's like, you know, this sort of chaotic nature of, you know, when you have 50 people or 100 people in an audience, how they're all going in 50 or 100 different directions. When those moments would come around, the audience would sort of gel, you know, for a moment. And it was noticeable to me, like other people are picking up on this, that these guys have some ideas that don't sound like anything else that you're hearing, you know, from other bands.
Really cool.
And that's the shit that really like makes the hair stand up in the back of my neck. You know, I mean, I love a great pop song. But the stuff that really moves me is the stuff that sort of lives at the edges, you know, and then can be brought into mainstream. And a lot of the music, you know, even as much as, you know, Stefan might hate to admit, like he was a big, you know, I mean, Stefan listened to everything. You know, when I gave him control of the stereo on those many trips that we had together in the car, you never knew. He'd make these mixtapes and you'd never know like what song was going to come next. It could be, you know, Madonna, or it could be Testament. You know, he would go out of his way to just, you know, sort of keep you guessing. But, you know, it was very important early on for them to sort of find their own path and not, it was very intentional that they wanted to be hypersensitive to not sounding like they were borrowing too obviously from, you know, their influences.
I'm wondering, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, and a lot of their influences were bands that had sort of come from the edge of mainstream, or, you know, from the edges and been brought mainstream, you know, the Smiths and, you know, The Cure and, you know, Depeche Mode and, you know, obviously, you know, Slayer and, you know, other stuff that really sort of started at the fringes and then found an audience, you know, over time through authenticity.
That's really interesting to think about them in that way, because so often we think about them in the context of their influences, but not necessarily in the path of their influences. And that resonates with me, because that's absolutely what they did. Was they moved from, I think, from the fringe to find a wide audience.
Right. There's something else. You just struck a memory of, there was a quality that they had even early on. This sort of, and, you know, I don't want to keep saying, you know, this sort of commitment to authenticity, but like one of the mechanisms that they had as a young band that many other young bands don't, is that they were brutal, about songs and parts of songs, and, you know, recognized sort of early on that, you know, if anybody in the band didn't like a song or didn't like a part of a song, they had the freedom. There was a sort of, you know, democratic, you know, a weird sort of democratic writer tension. So democratic in that anyone in the band could speak up at any time at rehearsal, or, you know, when they were writing out a set list, and just say, you know what, that song sucks, or that part of that song sucks. That one needs to go back to the woodshed and we need to rework that part, or I'm tired of playing that song. You know, that song sounds like so-and-so. And that was the fastest way to make any song radioactive to everyone in the band, was to say, oh, that song sounds like, you know, Chili Peppers, or that song sounds like, you know, other bands that were of the moment, Death Angel, or, you know, Fungo Mungo, you know, other bands that were sort of cutting their teeth from, you know, from the area. And they, the point about the writer tension is, you know, the ideas for songs and the sort of freedom to curate was really important. I mean, that writer tension is sort of like this critical element in a lot of great bands, where, you know, when talented people are productively competitive rather than destructively competitive, they tend to draw better quality ideas out of each other than they would tend to create on their own. And there are a lot of great sort of writer combinations who talk about this. Don Henley and Glenn Frey obviously talk a lot about this. Lennon and McCartney talk a lot about this. And I'm not, you know, I'm not equating, you know.
Oh, you can. This is the space for that.
Oh, okay. All right. Totally. This is the one place in the world where, like, oh yeah, that totally floats. Oh yeah, that checks out. No, but they were, you know, I mean, everybody was trying to come up with great ideas. And I wouldn't say that there were certain people, you know, who, like, secretly maybe their ideas, their input would be vetted a little bit more, you know, than if the ideas came from other places. But everybody had the freedom and the space to be able to chime in and put in their 2 cents. And what you end up with when you have that kind of dynamic and that kind of productive writer tension, where everyone's trying to get, you know, the better idea in, the better song in, is, you know, you end up with this sort of flywheel effect, and you end up with bands that play more dedicated, you know, live sets. The set lists turn out to be more like a best of album, you know, back in the day. Sorry, we're sort of dating ourselves here. Remember back when bands had best of albums? Well, what if your set list, even as a young band, even if you don't have a lot of songs, it's better to play a shorter set of just your better material than to try to fill out like, oh, we need to fill 10 more minutes. Let's fill this with bullshit. Don't play the shorter set. And so that they were very sort of committed early on to not being overly indulgent, as bands often tend to be.
That's really interesting to think about. I think about the creation process for this band often, and I consider what that's like, and your description of this tension obviously feels very real, and it's I think pretty well documented. But the fact that it was there so early on, and that you say that it's sort of unique, that it's not all too common.
It's pretty rare because usually in most bands there are, you have your type A personalities, who tend to be the louder voices in the room, and sometimes it's just the guy with the better gear, or the guy whose dad bought the PA.
Sure.
Or sometimes it's pretty obvious, like who the songwriter is in the band. And if there's only one really strong songwriter in the band, oftentimes it becomes, it develops its own sort of problems that have to be figured out along the way, because the power dynamic, depending on what other types of personality characteristics go along with that, that writer talent. If they don't have the confidence, they're not going to bring their ideas as freely. And if they have too much confidence, they can be a bully in the band, which, tends to result in revolving doors. And
any of those things can really shut down the creation process. So, and again, like I sort of I stick on this subject so often, I think, because it's one of the qualities that is so unique to this band. Here we are 9 albums later, that they've continued to.
Isn't that crazy?
It really is. And I would love to get your take on how crazy that is, but I want to go back to the first one first. Sure. So were there demos? I mean, Steph was bringing you stuff, but do you remember what was out or what you started working on first in terms of?
The band had never really been in the studio until, one of the first goals was, let's get rid of the junk and really focus on, the better ideas, the better songs with the better ideas. And let's, be students of good songwriting and students of good performance. And let's be that band who's, on time to rehearsal and on time to shows and respectful to the sound guy and, all that kind of thing. Because those are easy ways to stand out and distinguish yourselves. And to end up being like when there's a cancellation, it's like, oh, hey, so-and-so is really good and they're really easy to work with. I'll call them first. So there's, there were basics. The other thing that was playing out, and this sort of led to them doing a few demos, but there was an interesting dynamic in Sacramento around that time that there were a couple of different dynamics. There was sort of competitive rivalry with the Bay Area, which geographically Sacramento's sort of on the periphery of the Bay Area. We're 90 minutes from San Francisco and the greater Bay Area, where there were a lot of clubs, East Bay, South Bay. And then there's this sort of historical and perennial rivalry between Northern California and Southern California. But I discovered that there were some benefits to living in the shadow of the Bay Area, and a blessing in disguise to this sort of, Southern California and all the record companies and music publishers and industry concentration around Southern California being somewhat dismissive and seeing Sacramento like a backwater. Is that when that happens and you have a body of talent like we did, that it becomes it's given a little bit more time to develop, and it was sort of uniquely fertile musical ground. And so I don't think it's that it's that hard to understand why from that soil came, so many unique sounding groups. I mean, this was around the same time, Cake was coming out. Far was, coming up around that time.
And of course, Fallacy, often talked about.
And Fallacy, where, we stole Abe from Fallacy, but somehow managed to maintain, good enough relationships. I mean, it was a small community, small enough community that relationships mattered.
Yeah.
And the guys in Fallacy were, magnanimous enough to not, hold it against Abe or against us that, Abe, switched teams. And he really brought a style that, the prior drummer, John Taylor's a super, super gifted drummer. And it's his drumming that you hear on, the first couple of demos. But he's very pocket, very, meter specific, very sort of contained. And Abe kind of cut his teeth on jazz records, and, playing, I think for a while, I think he was center snare, in marching band and whatnot, which, I mean, those guys have to drill like crazy. They were like machines. But Abe was a student of different styles and was comfortable in playing, at or over like the edges, blurring the lines sometimes. And, there was this sort of animalistic kind of feel that came out of that. It was, there's this sort of alchemy that happens sometimes when you put things together that shouldn't necessarily click, and it makes something greater than its parts, greater than the sum of its parts. And this was one of those things.
Wow, that's really cool. And because Abe was a part of the band and then left to join Fallacy and then returned back
and then came back.
Was and Chi was already in the band when you had
correct,
when you had met them. Okay, so they were basically fully formed under your watch. They became the original, the classic lineup that we came to know prior to Frank's joining, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. Well, we made a couple of demos with John Taylor, and then Abe joined, and that was when literally it was just like the tumblers falling in a lock, because Abe was familiar with the personality dynamic in the band. I think he was sort of fluent with what the band was trying to become. And the band, while Abe was gone, the band had kind of worked some things out, sort of like figured itself out a little bit, and had survived the gauntlet where a lot of bands break up because they just, they can't get over themselves, and they can't make that hurdle from four guys playing the same music to being one band that sounds like a machine, greater than the sum of its parts. And so to some degree, the inner band dynamics had been de-risked a little bit for, if you will, for Abe. So it was easier for Abe to come back. Like it was like coming back to an ex-girlfriend, right? I kind of know what I'm supposed to do here, and now I don't have as much bullshit to deal with.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense.
Not that there wasn't plenty of bullshit for him to deal with, just, less of the young band bullshit and more of the, okay, now that we're sort of rolling up our sleeves and getting serious about this, throw ourselves in the trench together and figure it out.
Obviously, it's great when your favorite band tours in your town, but what do you do when they don't? You travel to see them, of course. And believe me when I tell you, the Hair Restoration Institute of Minnesota is worth traveling for. Hey, it's Woody. I'm lucky. HRI is 5 minutes away from my house. But if you aren't in the Twin Cities, You are also in luck. With their Hair by Air program, HRI will reimburse your flight, get you to and from the airport for free, and they have complimentary on-site hotel accommodations. Yeah, that's right. There's a hotel attached to HRI. This is literally the best case scenario if you want thick flowing hair like a Viking or a rock star or a lion. Well, maybe that's too much. Check out the Hair by Air program at the Hair Restoration Institute of Minnesota at hrimn.com. All right, now what are we going to do with this guy? We can't just leave him lying around. Right?
So was it before or after Abe joined? Two parts of this question. That the band was. At what point did they start playing outside of Sacramento and really spreading beyond that area? And then at what point did recording for Adrenaline get going?
So, well, there's a couple of cogs in that wheel. So, I mean, in terms of reaching out and playing out of the area, once the band had sort of gotten into the habit of vetting material, trying to only put their best material forward, we almost immediately started, picking up shows out of the area, and being somewhat strategic about doing, gig trades, finding bands that were in markets that we were trying to tap into, find a band that we fit with musically, and then trade, like bring them into Sacramento, and we would, go and, play on their turf and try to make it as fair a trade as possible.
So do you offer like space for that? Do you have to like you have some sort of venue share? How does that work?
So, I mean, this is actually one of the ways that we developed a relationship with Korn. I mean, as the story goes, there were some offers. There were things that were happening around the band. There was interest and attention happening around the band fairly early on. Like one of the demos that we cut, even with John, was a 3-song demo we cut with Frank Hannon, the guitar player for Tesla, who had a great home studio, and Frank was learning how to engineer, and that demo got us some attention. Even though the band was still trying to figure some things out stylistically, it was very clear that there was something that was happening with the band. This was a band that was starting to fire on all cylinders, not necessarily on every song, not necessarily on every part of every song, but there weren't just fleeting moments. There were entire cohesive musical themes that were formed by then. And that was around the time we started to get some attention. And so there was, the first offer we got was from a little indie label in the Bay Area. And then we got an offer from Metal Blade. Shout out to Mike Faley, the great Mike Faley. And then we got approached by Roadrunner. Shout out to the great Monty Connor. And then on the strength of that 3-song demo we cut with Frank, we got a demo deal offer from Atlantic. Shout out to Holly Hutchison. But it wasn't quite enough to get the engine to turn over, and the band was finding, like, okay, maybe we can do this. Like, maybe this is real, and this isn't just like bullshit fantasy, So we want to be careful. We want to be thoughtful about who we sign with, and how we manage this opportunity. And this was around the time that things had become strained with John, and the decision was made to reach back out to Abe and see if we could get him to come back to the band.
So that was happening concurrently, basically. John's exit, Abe's return, and then the demo deal offer, which is basically just an offer to cut another demo.
Yeah, we'll pay for the demo, and generally there are lots of strings that are attached. I mean, there's different sorts of demo deals, but back in those days, the big labels had bad habits, and one of the bad habits that was attached to a lot of these demo deal offers was, the label would pay for you to go into a real studio, maybe a better studio than you've been in before, maybe with a real engineer, real producer, basically leveling up to see, can you handle it? I mean, does this bring out, better product, better output from the band? But the quid pro quo generally was that that label would have rights to that demo, or sometimes attachments to even the songs that you recorded. It was just a lot of, we didn't really want to do a demo deal. It was flattering that, like, holy shit, it's Atlantic Records, but we didn't really want to do a demo deal. And this was around the time, again, as the band was sort of discovering in itself a new kind of confidence. We made the change to bring Abe back. There were a couple of songs, things that happened like pretty quickly after Abe came back to the band, sort of just flexing itself musically, that there were new things. It was like a whole new gear creatively that was happening around that time. And one of the very next thing that we went into the studio to cut was a 2-song demo with a guy named Eric Broyhill, who was an up-and-coming engineer here in Sacramento, who now has a world-class mastering facility. But this was the first real recording of 7 Words and Engine Number 9 that ended up being on the first record. And the first time we were in, I wouldn't say that it was necessarily a better studio than we'd been in before, because we'd been in a really fantastic local studio called Puss Cavern. I know, terrible name, great studio, wonderful people. I mean, like, brothers to this day. I mean, and that Puss Cavern has produced, tons of stuff for Tesla and Papa Roach and Oleander and, other stuff over the years. But, and we did a lot of in fact, we rehearsed for many years. A lot of the early recordings that we did were rehearsing in Puss Cavern, and Joe, the owner engineer, would just leave the mics on and the band would just, play. But this 2-song demo with Eric was the first time when the band started to get a sense of itself as a professional unit. That wasn't just, it wasn't just dreamland, like, hey, we maybe have something here. And so we tried some new things creatively, like on 7 Words, I ran Chino's vocal through a Leslie, which is a speaker amplifier that's typically used for organs, that creates this sort of warbling sound and whatnot. And something just clicked while we were in and recording that, and that really produced the first sort of album quality. Like, you could hear the record taking shape in just those 2 songs. And when that 2-song demo, when I first started sending it out to people, you could feel the temperature in the water just change. I mean, we were happy with it, but like, this was the first time we would show up to gigs, and other bands that were on those shows with us would be talking about our demo, or we'd pull into the parking lot and they'd be playing our demo in their car out in the parking lot. Clubs, where I would find out sound guys at nightclubs were playing our demo as walk-up music. So it's like the doors would open, people are filling the club, they'd be playing our demo. And the first time we met the guys from Korn, and there's a great story I want to share with you about how the whole thing with Korn came to be. The first time we met the guys from Korn, they actually, one of the funny things was they actually asked us if we had any more copies of that original 2-song demo, because they had played theirs to death.
No way, that's so cool.
And I'm like, and we, of course, you're not aware of all of this happening.
Right.
I mean, the way that buzz happens for a band is, it eventually comes back to you. But until it comes back to you, there's all this stuff that's happening, sort of in the shadows, where, people are telling their friends, or, turning other people on to this crazy band Deftones from SAC. And so that was happening, and we weren't really aware of a lot of that. But that demo led to a really interesting and formative time It's really sort of changed everything. The showcases that came out of that. So for background, one of the interesting things that happened was I had booked the band on this tour, and we were at this point sort of headlining, enough clubs in enough cities up and down the state of California. And I know people that aren't from California don't realize how big the state is, but even as an unsigned band, we were almost to the point where we could headline enough cities and enough clubs where we could almost stay on the road full time. Certainly we could go out every other month and, spend 3 weeks on the road as an unsigned band. And around this time, we did a show in Bakersfield, of all places. And I ended up meeting this up and coming producer from LA who happened to be there that night to see Cradle of Thorns, band on Triple X back in the day that he was producing. But this up and coming producer was Ross Robinson, and he took me out to his Volvo, his Volvo that the wheels were about to fall off of in the parking lot. And he played me this demo for this band from LA that he was working with, a band from Huntington Beach called Korn. And he's like, these guys are killing it in LA right now. And they just got a record deal with Happy Walters' label at Epic, Immortal, but they just fired their managers. It's not, there's kind of like this weird dynamic and there's a lot of uncertainty or whatever, but they're killing it in LA. They've never played outside of LA. And I'm like, well, we should bring them up to Northern California. We headline a bunch of shows up there. I'll bring them in, and you work it out for us to play, to bigger audiences, bigger clubs in LA. Deftones had played LA and I think San Diego a couple of times, but we were still sort of in our earlier stages. We really hadn't gone and worked these clubs with the new 2-song demo and the new sort of incarnation of the band. And so Ross and I basically conspired for the two bands to help each other. And I made arrangements for Korn to support Deftones on 4 shows in Northern California, and Ross arranged for Korn to have Deftones support an equal number of shows in SoCal. And the first date of this gig trade was a story you might like. There was the first date the two bands actually met was at a club called Dragonfly in Hollywood. And Korn was a big band. Even though they were already signed, the first record hadn't come out, they were really sort of embraced still as a local band. And the show was packed mostly by Korn's audience. Deftones, like I said, had played LA a little bit, but this was really the first chance for us to play for a full house. There were a lot of industry folks there as well. Couple labels that I had invited, but a ton of other folks that were there to see Korn because they were a free agent. They were looking for new management. And they were one of the biggest bands on the scene at the time. And there was a lot of anxiety inside the Korn camp, around this time because they didn't have management, and their label was stressed because they really wanted to get the first record out, and all this kind of stuff. So they were sort of regrouping. And here come Deftones into the middle of all of this to support this important show that Korn had lined up at Dragonfly, as well as a couple other dates. And Deftones annihilated the place. We fucking destroyed the place. It was palpable. Like there was nothing left. And a couple of interesting things happened. So like literally the room full of industry, which are always like these jaded people who've seen it all, done it all, were clearly back on their heels like, holy shit, what the fuck was that? And true to form, like this was not lost on the guys in Korn who were like, holy shit, we better up our game tonight. These guys just showed us what for. And Jonathan, the singer for Korn, didn't want to go on. Like he literally genuinely refused to follow the band. He was like, fuck that. I'm not going out there. I'm not playing after that. And he literally, people had to, his guys in his band and other people in their circle of friends literally had to go and talk him into it because it was such an important show for them.
Wow.
And then, of course, that was just the first of a few different nights. We played, I think Huntington Beach, we played Fullerton, we played San Diego, and then I brought the band up. And fortunately, that night at Dragonfly was one of the best shows that Deftones had ever played up to that point. They really sort of rose to the occasion, and shit just got instantly overnight very serious with, I knew guys at record companies from having worked, demos for other bands. And fortunately, the two bands hit it off. And the shows that we did for them, that we brought them up for in Northern California, were their first shows outside of SoCal. And the first of those, fun fact, this is another Chi Chang story. So Chi, and this is, we could sell out any club in Sacramento, on our own. We don't need strong support. We don't, we can do whatever we want in terms of like who else we invite to come play with us at this point in time. And Chi was a big fan of Cake. Other guys in the band were also fans of Cake. I was friends with, John McRae a little bit, we knew of each other. And she's like, hey, we should have Cake come play this show. It was just so absurd. I'm like, fuck it, let's do it. So like I reach out, I talk to the club, and I'm like, so this is what we want to do. We want to bring this band up that's never played Sacramento before. This band called Korn, and then Cake, insert joke here, Cake and Korn, food bands. And Cake's like, cool, we'll do the show, but we want to invite one more band. We owe a show to this band, this folk band from San Francisco called the Tin Men. And we're like, cool, we'll make it a 4-band show. We'll have the Tin Men open, then Korn, then Cake, then Deftones. And it was just ludicrous because Cake and Deftones either band could sell out any club in Sacramento. And for the two bands with totally different audience demographics, it was just ludicrous for them to ever be on the same bill for any reason. But the two bands just sort of, as an inside joke, like, fuck it, let's, this act of camaraderie, whatever. We played the Cattle Club, and this is a small but very famous club. And this was the club that, like, all the bands from that time, like Pearl Jam played there first, Alice in Chains played there first, Soundgarden played there first, Rage Against the Machine played there first, Smashing Pumpkins played there first, and this was our home turf for Deftones. This was the place where we really sort of cut our teeth. And the guys that ran the club, were, like family to us. But this club is small. People don't realize this club, the fire code capacity in this club is like 280. But with this bill, we probably could have done 1,000 tickets. Yeah. So the line is like down the street, and we oversold, probably did 650 paid. Oh, wow. Now it's long enough ago that, and I just kept
statute of limitations.
And I was like, Jerry, just, 10 more, because the line is just like down the street. Yeah. And everyone's looking, like, everyone know, like, they're sweating. People in line are like, holy shit, are we going to get in? Are we going to be able to, and I'm just like, come on, Jerry, 10 more people, come on, 5 more minutes, just, a few more. He's like, Dave, this is ludicrous. You literally physically could not fit more people in the room. But we turned the place into an anthill. And it was like a one night only thing. This was never going to happen again, this particular group of bands. And so that was Korn's first exposure to Northern California, was this, insane, being inside the body of the beast that was the Cattle Club that night for their very first show outside of Southern California. And that was around the time Maverick, came into the picture. I was getting phone calls and requests for showcases from other labels. But around this time, through some mutual friends, folks at Maverick had gotten this 2-song demo. And I made arrangements for the band to do a private show for the guy who formed the label with Madonna, her manager Freddie DeMann, and their A&R rep at the time, Guy Osiri. And Freddie was a legend, so I was a little starstruck doing this, because aside from running Madonna's label, I'm an artist manager, and here's the guy who, in addition to running Madonna's label, he's Madonna's manager from like day one, and also managed Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, and it was just, he was a legend. So it was a real kick for me as well, to bring my band into this little private room that they had rented for us to play down in LA. And we went through all this trouble to, drive down there and set up our gear, and had hours to like tune everything and make sure it's all perfect. And then like literally, we're prepared to play as long as it takes, as many songs. Like before the second song even finished, Freddie DeMann taps me on the shoulder and he says, "We're good. Let's do this." And so, high fives all around. Well, in hindsight, I have to say, there were a lot of other labels that were pursuing us, Capitol, Interscope, Warner, EMI, and others, and some really like big name people that were interested. And in hindsight, I've always wondered, like, should we have let that sort of develop a little bit to get more leverage? Because we ended up signing not the greatest deal with Maverick, because they kind of had us at that point. They romanced the band, and the band was like, every time a new term sheet would come through, I'd say, well, maybe we should ask for this or that, and the band's like, no, let's not piss them off. We don't want to scare them away. And I'm like, dude, chill. They're not going anywhere. But it was a big deal, because it was a chance for us to sign to what was, at the time, we were the 6th band signed to Maverick, which at the time was the hottest label in the world. And that's not hyperbole. They were just, Madonna was the biggest act in the world, and this was her private imprint that Warner Brothers was prioritizing every release from, and spending whatever it took to keep her happy. So it was a rare opportunity.
Yeah, I was wondering what it was in particular that had them so swept away, or so.
Well, and they also, they had a connection. I think the proximity and ages helped. I mean, you have to understand, Guy was 20. He couldn't even buy beer. I had to sneak him into shows. Because some of the clubs we were playing, were 21 and over. I would literally have to, try to make arrangements with club owners, like, hey, I need to bring this guy in. Is there a table or a booth I could put him in, or somewhere backstage, no beer at the table, I'll point him out to you so you know who he is, whatever, but like, I need to get him in. And there were times where sometimes he would show up at a show unannounced, and I would have to like make arrangements, like, oh, but Guy, what are you doing? I would have to go and run around and make last minute arrangements, and not always, were people happy about it. Like one of the clubs we played, 369 was this club in Fullerton that was very popular at the time, and for whatever reason, there was scrutiny from ABC, Alcoholic Beverage Control, the state agency that oversees nightclubs and makes sure that you're not serving alcohol to minors. Sure. And that kind of thing. They were under scrutiny for whatever reason, not because of us. And the guy's like, dude, I can't. You just got to tell him to like come another night. And I'm like, dude, I can't. This is Madonna's Guy. Yeah. I can't say no. So.
Wow, what a crazy time. What a crazy. Yeah. I mean, anytime a band is signed and you hear that story, or you think about that, imagining that process, and it always feels theatrical. It always feels like a movie. Did it feel like a movie for Deftones?
I mean, there were moments that were surreal. I mean, being, I was a student of the business from day one. Even as a kid, back when I was still learning to play guitar, I was one of these nerds who would pore over the back of records and look at the liner notes and the credits of like who was producing and what label it was on, and I mean, all of it. And so, for me to be in a room with Freddie DeMann, with this band that literally I brought from the ghetto of South Sac, and that, there was a chance that we were going to get to work with this guy. I just, I mean, it was a big deal. I didn't allow that to interfere with my, my thinking. I mean, we had lawyers and all that who were basically doing most of the negotiation for us, but it was surreal. It was a show Guy came to. Speaking of shows, Guy came to, and the moments were surreal. There was a Cattle Club show we did after that show with Korn and Cake, where I don't even remember who else was on the bill with us, but Guy flew up to see that because he wanted to see the band, like, in their native environment. I'm like,
in
all
their
right,
element.
buckle up, dude. And he ended up backstage. And you have to understand, when the way that the club is laid out and you're backstage, there was no exit door from backstage. So to get from backstage to the front door, you literally would have to cut through the middle of the crowd, who are packed in shoulder to shoulder with no breathing room between them. It would be like trying to move across the rail, in front of a Metallica concert.
Yeah.
Just, it's impossible. And so I had him backstage, and the crowd is being pushed forward. And this is a small club, small stage, maybe 18-inch deck, 24-inch deck off the floor. And so the crowd is just being pushed up, and Guy ends up on the side of the stage, like on the wing of the stage, and literally has the fear of God. He literally feels like he's going to die because this surge of bodies is literally going to spill over the stage, and we're all going to die, under a pile of bodies any second, because that's the energy in the room. But yeah, I mean, in the moment, if I'm honest, we're all, like long-tailed cats in a room full of rocking chairs, feeling like this is all going to fall apart tomorrow. Somebody's going to say something, somebody's going to do something wrong, they're going to change their mind, we're going to fuck this up, this can't possibly be happening. Yeah. So I mean, when you keep waiting for the shoe to drop and for something bad to happen that kills it, and it doesn't, and it keeps going, and the snowball keeps growing, it's quite a thing to witness.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Hey, it's Woody for the Hair Restoration Institute of Minnesota. I turned 40 this year, and more than any other birthday, I felt like this year I deserved to really treat myself. And above all else, the one thing that I really wanted to do for me was fix my hair. I started losing my hair 20 years ago. It was awful. I loved my hair. Losing it was miserable. I hated the way it looked and having to hide under a hat for family photos. Then I went to the Hair Restoration Institute of Minnesota. They're the #1 hair transplant clinic in the Midwest with hundreds of 5-star reviews. And getting my hair restored was actually a relaxing experience. It was sort of like a day at the spa. There was no pain. It was really fast healing. I mean, I was back on the air in just a couple of days. Whatever your hair loss, whatever your goal, they have the surgical, non-surgical, and cosmetic options for you. Schedule your free consultation at hrimn.com. That's hrimn.com.
What a tremendous story. And I keep thinking about you and Ross Robinson and the Volvo, basically the archetyping the musical revolution that would take place. Do you consider that? Do you think about that? Do you ever think about that meeting? And I mean, obviously there are a lot of other things that have to happen.
I mean, there were a lot of, I mean, in hindsight, it's hard not to, when you connect the dots, it's hard not to connect on that dot. And like, what were the chances of Ross? Because Ross didn't live in Bakersfield. The band, I mean, Korn was from Bakersfield, and I think Ross originally grew up around Bakersfield. And so it wasn't necessarily that unusual that he was there, but that he was there that night at that club, seeing a band he'd never heard of, who literally, I mean, Ross was ready to, I mean, if I'd said, you know, Ross, if I point at a random person and you go choke them to death right now in order for the privilege of producing Deftones first, like Ross would have been like, I'm going to hate myself forever, but if this is what I have to do, he was a man possessed, like this has to happen.
Yeah.
And so it really sort of felt like there was some kismet happening in that moment, you know, like an alchemy that you can't quite put your finger on. But that, I mean, I was just being opportunistic that like, okay, here's a band that we fit with musically that can, you know, move the ball downfield for me, doing basically, you know, just the next cycle of developing our reach. And if we end up doing a deal and this, you know, we end up, you know, finding the right label or the right time, circumstances or whatever to, then fine. But if not, we need a base to be able to fall back on.
Totally.
So, you know, for Ross to become who he became, and, you know, Slipknot and Limp Bizkit and, you know, the other things that, you know, that he came from his hands, that followed that.
Crazy.
After that first Korn record.
Prolific. Yeah.
I mean, it was insane. So
what did he do initially for Deftones? He did
so there was a 2-song demo that Maverick, so there was, Korn was going to go out and do like a promotional tour of some West Coast dates, and they had hired an agent, Andy Summers at ICM, and they were putting some dates together, and I saw that as an opportunity for us to go play markets we hadn't played before, Phoenix, Vegas, you know. So I'm like, okay, I want to go out and, you know, like the door's open. If we are able somehow to like throw the guys in an RV or a van or whatever it is, you know, Korn will take us out and we'll be able to play these new markets. But the guys didn't want to go out and do another loop on the same 2-song demo. And Maverick's like, well, and, you know, Ross really was lobbying to produce the first record, you know, and the label was not quite sure because Ross was, you know, an unknown, you know, at that moment.
It's so fun to think about.
Little did they know.
Yeah, right.
But oh, yeah, I just reminded of another funny story. So Maverick's like, cool, we'll put up, I don't remember what it was, 10 grand or whatever it is, you know, and Ross can do it. You know, he can do a demo. We'll do like a promo cassette, another couple of songs. And we'll bring you guys down. And, you know, where does Ross want to go? And Ross is like, fuck, well, let's go to Sound City, which if you're a nerd about the business, this is Sound City is where, you know, Fleetwood Mac Rumors was cut, and Tom Petty and Rage Against the Machine. And I mean, just like this was church, you know, for a lot of bands. Nirvana, you know, Sound City. So, you know, we make the deal, Maverick commits the budget. Ross is like, okay, come down, you know, we'll go do a walkthrough, you know, like the day before, and then we'll load in the next day, just so, you know, like, you know, you get the lay of the place and all this. And we walk in, and you know, it's like any studio on a non-recording day, the place is, you know, it's desolate, and you're walking down the hall, and it's just every record you ever loved, you know, gold and platinum records lining the wall. You're like, okay, we have definitely fucked up. We are way in over our head. What have we done? And then we walk in, we're like, oh, which studio? Okay, we're in Studio A. So we, you know, go down the hall, we, you know, make the turn, you know, open the, you know, the foot thick door. And there's a guy in there who's like spinning reels, like rewinding reels. And we don't know who he is. And, Ross is like, oh, hey, Dave, this is Garth. Garth, this is Dave. You know, Garth, this is Deftones in his band. I'm doing these, you know, I'm doing a couple of songs for Maverick, blah, blah, blah. It was Garth Richardson, who did Rage Against the Machine, which at that moment in time, Deftones was, I mean, that first Rage Against the Machine record was on that and Weezer were on full rotation for the band. So like for them, like they're all of a sudden, like here's the guy at the console in the room where they made, Rage Against the Machine's record. The guys are like, like speechless, fish out of water. Anyhow, cool. that was Root and Nosebleed that were two more songs that ended up on Adrenaline. And it was quite an odyssey that ended up having to get mixed a couple of times. And I think ultimately ended up getting mixed at Malibu Ranch, which is where Ross did the Korn records, and I think Limp Bizkit and other stuff. Malibu's another sort of famous studio, but it was a little bit of an odyssey to get the mixes right and make the label happy. But fortunately, they were stoked, and the initial reception from the promotion people and the radio people was like, hey, we could probably go out and service alternative, with this, and pick up some specialty airplay, or at least like there was something that the label felt like they could start to work with. It was unclear if those songs, if those recordings were going to end up surviving to be used on the record. This was before Terry Date, got brought in, but there was discussion like maybe we could use this. I think Ross did end up submitting a budget like, hey, if you let me do it, I can bring it in for less, but ultimately the decision was, here's this young band. We really want to make sure that we capture, lightning in a bottle. Maybe there's a chance for us to do something with Ross down the road, which obviously there was. They brought, Terry in, and I think, Terry, who had done some records that the band was, big fans of, obviously, Pantera and whatnot.
Yeah.
That was formative, but I think it like shocked the band when Terry walks in and he's just like this dude in a t-shirt and Levi's with, holes in the pockets. And he's like, hey, what's up? Just like totally, unaffected. And they're like, that's Terry Date. So
they were expecting some drill sergeant or something.
Yeah, we had met a couple of people, like Atlantic had flown some, I don't want to name any people, but like other people who had done famous records. But
sure.
At the time, Atlantic was a little bit more about, bombastic, flash and polish and, that kind of thing, which was not the direction that the guys in the band wanted to do. They wanted to do something that was, more organic and earthy. And I think that's definitely what we got with Terry.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear you talk about their goals for the album, to hear them talk about what they wanted to make, what they wanted to create. Because I'm of the position that there is great intention and purpose behind every one of their albums, while they would always say, oh, we go in and we play and it's organic and we make what we make, and then that's what it is. But no, there's a lot more.
I mean, I would say that's fairly accurate. I mean, the guys had, there's always like fear when they're going into making it, and there's always pressure from the label, even if the label doesn't like overtly turn the screws, like, hey fucker, we need something to go, to radio with.
Yeah.
Which like after you've made your first record, you understand that's you have to feed the beast to some degree, or you're hoping to come out of the process with something that could feed the beast. You don't want to be one of those bands that like has to go back in and like, we don't have a single, let's go do two more. Like, what else you got? Or like, maybe we'll chop this song up and, we'll send it to so-and-so for, to remix, and turn that into a single.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, and they didn't really want to have to go through all of that.
Sure.
But
so going into Adrenaline, was there some confidence then? All right, we've got these 4 songs. We just need to round out an album.
There was an album's worth of material, or damn near, that there was pretty strong consensus about. The band felt good about, Terry felt good about, the label felt good about. And there were, even from the demos and the live performances, and I mean, one of the things that we did even before there was the labels and producers in our orbit was I had a portable DAT machine. Remember DAT tapes?
Sure.
Digital audio tapes. So for the kids at home, there used to be these tiny little cassettes. It was one of the first generations of digital recording where you would, you'd get high fidelity recordings. And I had a couple of condenser mics, and I would go to rehearsals and I would set up, the DAT machine and splay the mics at 90 degrees, just so there's no such thing as a sweet spot when you're doing live recordings like that. You're always trying to catch a tiger by the tail, but you figure, okay, there's certain spots in the room that at least you can hear everything, on playback. You can get enough of the vocal, and the guitar's not drowning out the kick drum or whatever it is.
Totally.
And so we were in the habit of making those tapes, and so a lot of those tapes we were sending, when Maverick was in the picture and Terry was in the picture, we ended up sharing a lot of that stuff. So they were aware of what things sounded like just naturally, and just like roll tape. Here's what the band sounds like.
Yeah.
It was really important for us to try to preserve as much of that as possible. And then Terry, when he first started coming down for pre-production, he just sort of continued that practice. He had his own system, but he was basically just recording live to DAT to get a feel for what songs we had to work with, and how well, if there were any arrangements that were still sort of nebulous or whatever, because there were always new songs that were coming into the picture. And as is always the process, sometimes it takes a couple of cycles, creative cycles, for a song, for all the parts of the song to sort of click into place. And so you end up sometimes with sections that are, temped in, just like temporarily, like, okay, well, here's a bridge that'll work for now. We just need to get from point A to point B, and then, we'll maybe come back to this, and lock it in, when it comes time for the record, or maybe something will come to us. And a lot of the times, they would find lightning in a bottle and things would click into place. So they'd try different things at different shows and go, did you catch that? Did you catch that one part there? Dude, that's the one. And so these things
That's so cool.
These things would just sort of coalesce,
Do you have an example of that? Can you recall an example of that? It's probably kind of tough to pin down. Do you remember that random part of a song? Oh,
so
really?
Bored was a song that before there was a vocal, it was a riff and a beat. And I've since given all the the DATs back to, and all the reels and everything. I co-produced everything in those days, so it's like all those stuff would come to live with me. And I had the archive, and it took the band actually a few years to finally come back and go, oh yeah, Dave, you have you have this treasure trove of like shit we probably don't want to have come leak from
Totally
some BitTorrent or whatever. And I'm like, well, it's it's totally safe here, but sure, whatever. So they got everything back, but the origins of Bored came from some of those like early sessions, and honestly, it was some of my favorite stuff to listen back to, just because like when you like the first sort of glimmer of like, holy shit, this riff is 10 feet tall, that turn is 10 feet tall. Like you can see the song sort of taking shape, and Chino singing, like he didn't even have words yet, but he would just like throw out lines or sounds to sort of like bridge, augment something to like, here's where the vocal harmony would be to carry through, to the one. And so those were, those are that was church. That was the greatest.
Yeah. Oh wow, that's priceless. I mean, I've sort of come to learn that I think that process is still largely in place, that songwriting process. And they did that. Chino did that song Exploder after Ohms was released, and you hear some of those elements, some of those like vocalizations, and some of the ideas that.
Right.
I love the life of a song. There's something about the life of a song but those earliest germs, those germs are really hard to find, especially with this band. So like hearing you talk about it is so cool.
That's, I mean, that is the lifeblood. Like that's, everything. To be there when something, like peeks its head out. And you can almost feel it, and you'll catch, there's like a look that people will, they'll go around the room like, oh, did you hear it? Did you catch that? What was that? Do that again. So yeah, and that's everything. I mean, from my, my vantage point, my, the whole impetus, my, arc as a manager was all about like being the antidote to injustice. And the greatest injustice is when those great moments happen and everyone knows it, and then it comes to nothing, or the world doesn't get a chance to hear it, or it ends up not making the record, or it ends up, there's so many ways that you have to get lucky, for and to have the confidence, as a band, when you're in those moments creatively, and be vulnerable and say, well, what if we did this? And like sometimes there's loud voices of people lobbying, in different directions, and sometimes it's the quiet voice in the room that goes, I don't know, I kind of like that thing actually, and then people take a fresh look at it, and now it's like they're one yes away from, now it's unanimous, and we commit to it, and we give it the full force and energy. And a lot of times those, it's just a beautiful sort of, it's a thing that doesn't have words. There's probably a word in French, but or maybe Latin, but maybe not English. There isn't a word for that moment.
Oh man, that's such a beautiful thing. Wow, that's amazing. I feel such a kinship with you now too. That's sort of like the badge of honor that I try to take on now as a, as a radio person, as a person who presents music all the time. And really a large part of, my motivation for this podcast, like, even though my favorite band is a pretty fucking big band, like not enough people have heard them. If you ask me, there aren't enough.
Still, isn't
There's
it
still
weird?
A lot.
Isn't it weird and cool? Like, on one hand, they're still doing they still have that sort of dedication to authenticity and being vulnerable to their audience, and all the things that, we started out with as, as the, the sort of first set of best practices. Like this is what a band should, this is how a band should behave. This is how a band should be a brotherhood, trench warfare, us against the world. And yet they've been so successful at it. They have such an insanely rabid, dedicated fan base, full credit. There's only a handful of bands that you could even use in the same sentence who have the same level of dedication, Tool, or, bands that are just icons, who were icons before Deftones. I remember taking the guys actually to see Tool when Tool was out on their first, and it was early enough in Deftones. This was probably still when John Taylor was in the band, and so the band's like still dealing with their sort of early uncertainties about themselves, and see Maynard up there just crushing, owning people's souls in this room, the Trocadero in San Francisco. That would have been 93, I want to say. And Tool was like, it was like watching a living, breathing beast, emerge, onto the stage and just own like you lost complete track of time, and you're like, spit out the other end. You're like, holy shit, that was 2 hours ago.
And one song.
And one song, or 2 songs.
Two, maybe. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool how they've developed this rabid fan base, and yet for so many people, they still are an outlier.
Yeah.
That they are able to. They're one of those very, very few bands who's sort of able to play best of both worlds, where they don't have to play all the games necessarily. They've got just enough material that they can work radio with, and then go out and be whoever they want to be, for the rest of the record, and and live and all that. And over time, obviously, and like now there's actually a catalog of songs that have fared well at radio. And I imagine, I'm not privy anymore to the ASCAP and BMI checks, from having your songs played at football games and hockey arenas and stuff like that. But it adds up, especially over time.
Yeah, totally. Wow, I'm just so many things that just are racing. It's really fun to think about. And you attribute all that longevity, it sounds like, to that commitment to
each other,
just being to each other. Yeah.
And having high standards. It's like a combination of things that don't, you can't train them into people. They just happen organically, or they don't. And in most bands, they don't.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, if you see, the bands that have survived the test of time, by and large, a lot of times, disproportionately, are bands who are still playing with the same guys, the same, you too.
Yeah.
It's the same guys, have been doing it since the 70s in their case.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Well, this is going to maybe require a little bit of speculation, and I hope you don't think it's out of line if I ask you this, but
Sure.
What you've said has certainly brought to mind the recent changeover in lineup with Deftones and with Sergio's departure. And I've talked to fans. I feel like I've talked a few fans off ledges, but I feel pretty confident myself. Like I don't, well, obviously Sergio's loss was a big blow, and his joining the band was much later, after you weren't working with the band anymore. Right. You were. So I don't know. But
it caught a lot of people by surprise, because I think, a lot of people sort of saw Sergio as being a medicinal element as well as a creative element, because he came in to fill a sort of sacred hole that, if you knew anything about how do you replace a guy like Chi? Where do you find what was he, 6'3" Chinese guy with dreads, and a sense of humor, who wants to play, music like this, and sing and swing his hair around and, tell jokes and scream into the mic, and then, just be the sort of Buddhist, off stage that endeared so many people to him. It was just a force to be reckoned with, and on so many levels. How do you fill those shoes? And so I think I can only imagine the process that Sergio must have gone through to reconcile for himself, like how big a task this was going to be, and what kind of soul and character, I would imagine is necessary to give yourself into a set of circumstances like that, and be selfless for as long as, as apparently, he was. And I think it was, he came in sort of laterally because of, his time with Quicksand. He came in with a lot of sort of gravitas and, respect, and, he didn't have to be the new guy. He didn't have to take that gig. There were other things that he could have done. But I am, I'm not privy to all of the rationale that went into why he's no longer there. I mean, I'm sure I've heard some of the same things that other people have heard. I was a little surprised by it myself. You know, it's a tough thing. I can only imagine. I mean, and this is purely me speculating,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
But when you put people through impossible circumstances, in a band with a career, that has lasted as long and has survived as many roller coasters and issues as this band has, many of them self-inflicted. It's a little bit like going to war, and you see these guys come back, from warfare, and they're changed. There's like a PTSD. There's a little, it's traumatic. And maybe for them it was impossible that anyone else, once the link was broken, that it could only be filled, with something that was after the fact. And I'm not going to make excuses. It's honestly out of line for me to even, hazard a guess at what was going on behind the scenes, but I'm just sort of trying to rationalize, how do you get there? How do you go from where that relationship started and to the way it ended? Now, who knows what other dynamics are at play. I will tell you, we're around any band, there is an organization of other people who are involved, whose input is being factored. That's, not always, observable to,
Totally.
To people outside the circle. So, maybe relationships were strained in ways that are non-obvious.
Yeah.
But
that's certainly my gut feeling. I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like the chemistry is always the most important part about this band. And if that to me just logically feels like the only thing that could have been threatened, that would have justified that move, that decision. Right. Is just that the chemistry was somehow threatened. But do you feel any reason to worry that they're not going to find a way forward? My understanding is that they're
I worry
already
about that with every record, actually.
Do you really? Do you?
Well, there's always stuff, I mean, there's always stuff. I was a little surprised, when Steph didn't want to go overseas.
Yeah.
I was like, you started this band. I mean, how do you not go do those dates?
Yeah.
I mean, if they have to put a bubble, around you for you to have the level of security or sense of safety or whatever it is that you need. I mean, every artist that operates at this level, as I'm sure you've seen 100 times, they have different needs, and Sure. It doesn't all necessarily make sense, on paper, but in the moment when you live it and breathe it and wake up with it and go to sleep with it at night, there are cocoons that a lot of these people sort of need to, to function and operate and to forget about the distractions, so they can just, be creative and be focused and do the show or make the record or whatever it is that they need to be, focused on. Mm. So I was surprised that it got to that point, but we know in the live business, there are contractual commitments that are made to promoters and events and festivals and whatnot that happen months, in advance. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of calculus that goes into how the economics for a particular tour work or don't work, or what's necessary to make them work. And obviously the cocoon that's necessary goes into that. But if it wasn't part of the original calculus, and in order to make it work, the economics don't work anymore, I can imagine, bands or artists being put in situations where they have to make impossible decisions, in the moment. Do I break the contract with, my brother in the band, or do I break the contract with, 20 promoters in Europe?
Right. Yeah.
And how do you make that choice? There's no good answer to that.
Yeah.
So you make the decision that's easiest for you to live with, and maybe that seems like the right thing to do for good business, so that people will contract with you for the next tour and not hold it over you, which could be very expensive.
Yeah, I would
You know what I
imagine
mean?
so,
It's like
yeah.
you're always, as a band, you're constantly trying to improve on whatever the numbers were last time.
Sure.
So whatever you got for your guarantees, the last tour, you want at least that, and a little bit more the next time around. And so every time you leave somebody with headaches and nightmares, and you were perceived to underperform relative to their expectations, those become very difficult conversations.
Totally. And yet they somehow continued to show up and do the thing.
Right.
And there's some magic there that's just, it's undeniable. Right. It's such an
Lance,
force.
the guy that ended up filling in, Lance Jackman is another monster player here from Sacramento. Yeah. And so, props to him for, being ready and able, in the moment to fill what, again, just as Sergio must have felt stepping in, the vacuum for Chi, I can only imagine,
right.
What does Lance feel stepping in for Stefan, who was like, the king of crunch and the architect of all of this. So how surreal must that have felt?
Truly.
So,
is it surreal to think about Steph and that dude that you were given rides to back in the day, and this person that this king of crunch, as you put it, like,
back then and if he ever hears this, he'll go, oh God, don't say it. His nickname was Noodle, because he would, once he would like set up the gear back in his Guitar Tech days, he would set up all the gear, and then he would pull out the guitar, tune it, and then just sit there and, noodle like Megadeth riffs or, whatever, and just drive everyone crazy as everyone else in the band is trying to set up the drums or, set up mics. The sound guys just like, I had people in my ear like, Dave, can you please get him?
That's so good.
Noodle, can you please,
Noodle. Oh my God. That's
so he'll Stefan and I are great. We exchanged birthday, greetings and all this kind of stuff. And if he ever hears that, that'll all come to a grinding. I'll be like, dude, my one secret. How could you say that?
Well, we're far enough into this conversation that I'm sure at this point he's probably like, I've heard all this before.
Right. I lived it. He doesn't.
He doesn't need.
He'll say he lived it. He doesn't have to hear it all over again.
Exactly. Totally. Well, I've kept you for nearly 2 hours, so as I like to wrap things up, I'm going to ask you to offer up a couple recommendations. This is inspired by something that Chino said on a podcast, where the only reason he shares music links, the exclusively links to music on social media, is because he thinks that's the best thing that he could do on social media, is put people on to something new. So in that spirit, can you offer me any recommendation? Usually I ask for 3, but even if you got one thing that you think people, and it doesn't have to be limited to music by any means, it can be anything in the world that you think people should give a little time to, what would you recommend?
Oh, wow. This is one of those things where, like, damn it, you should have emailed me this, so I had some time to think about it.
I swear I put it in an email. I'm sorry.
That's all right. No, wow. I'm sure that as soon as we're done here, like 5 things will come to me like, well, why didn't you say this? Why didn't you say that?
It can be selfish. You could plug it. It could be, no. It could be something artistic or something serious. Not that art isn't serious, but anything in the world?
Okay, I have a thing, and this is sort of like, it's a little bit of the moment. So if people are listening to this, a year from now or 2 years from now, I don't know how trite or obscure or whatever this might sound, but it's not yet related to music, but is part of a tsunami of change that we're witnessing right now in real time that will inevitably involve music. It actually relates to something else. So maybe there's two things. One is I am part of the sort of exodus from Twitter. There's a lot of stuff that's going on right now with Twitter, and I don't want to be polarizing. I have my own opinions about things, and I am big fans of some of the people involved for some of the things that they've done, but I see some pretty grand mistakes being made, like in real time, and it's unfortunate and unnecessary. So one of the new things that I've been a part of just literally for like the last few weeks is this decentralized social network called Mastodon that thinks of itself as the Fediverse, which is the decentralized, web. Okay. And way for people to be able to communicate. And it doesn't necessarily have all the same features as, Twitter and other social networks, but it does have the advantage of being decentralized. So there's basically a community of people who decide as a community what floats, what doesn't float. And there's, every hub has its own sort of content filters and curation, and you can join whatever hub you want. And so if you want one where you can say anything and post whatever objectionable content, or arguably objectionable content, sure. In some hubs, more power to you, knock yourself out. But anyhow, it has grown so rapidly and so robustly in such a short period of time. So if people are interested, actually by the time this comes out, probably it'll be much more fully formed, and it won't seem quite as novel maybe as it does as I sit here 30 days in, on the network, but it's called Mastodon.
Mastodon, all right.
And it's a little bit like, you could think of it like Twitter, but decentralized, where there's not one boss. There's a community of people who decide. Yeah.
It sounds sort of similar to Reddit in some ways, except for Reddit maybe sounds like a little bit more like... It's still a
for-profit, right. The difference is Reddit's for-profit and runs advertising and does content curation, even if more liberally. Mastodon, the different hubs have the control over content curation, and there are no ads.
No ads are a good thing.
So it's just, the people who you follow or that follow you in real-time conversations, real-time problems. And a lot of the early adoption has been, educators, scientists, philosophers, technologists. There's a lot of people that I like to think of as being from among the best and brightest, who are trying to make the world a better place and make the web more functional in facilitating, best practices around the world.
Very cool.
So, and then the second part of that that's related, and I'll be brief in this, is just how the world is changing in user-generated content basically reshaped the web over the last few years. And I think mostly on a renaissance of tools for photo and video and, short form content. But most of that audience are not musicians. Roughly 80% of that audience are people who are not musicians, have never heard themselves play music well. And there is, as we speak, and this will probably still be true when this airs, that there is a wave of new tools coming out that are making it easier for people to express themselves musically. Some of which, are AI engines with, generative, output systems, and you click a button and a piece of music comes out. And some of them are easy to use tools coming from places like Lander and Splice and Native Instruments and whatnot. And it's all very noble. But what I think the outcome of all of that is going to be is that the next wave of user-generated content, the next $1 trillion in market capitalization that we're going to see, is going to be from that 80% of the audience who are now discovering that they have a broader relationship with music, and they have a choice that they can make, that they can hear or be heard, and through easier means than before. No strings, no frets, no keys, no, totally reinvented frictionless interfaces that will accommodate whatever creative impulses they have. And so it's not just going to be photo and video the next time around. It's going to be music from brand new sources.
That's really exciting. People are motivated and driven. I mean, while none of the content, you're absolutely correct, is music being created, it's people lip syncing and dancing to music.
Sure,
it's people doing their dance routines, or music is people still love picking a song and making that a part of their post, or so that registers. That's really exciting.
Music is inherently interactive, in that way. And there's an interesting thing that happens in the brain. And this was part of what made even Guitar Hero, very successful, was, and rhythm games, all of them, not just Guitar Hero, but one of the interesting mechanics that people discovered, neurologists discovered, was that the brain was tricking itself into thinking that it was actually in control of the music. And because so much music, regardless of what style or part of the world it's from, it's inherently interactive. And our response to it is always this sort of physical, involuntary, we tap our toes and, drum our feet, and we dance and drum on the steering wheel and air guitar, and we want to be a part of it. And so there's a secular change that's going to happen because the technology is making it easier for people to express themselves. They're going to be discovering that they can do that with music now, for the first time.
Oh, that's really exciting. I'm excited for my kids to be much more adept musicians than I am.
Yeah, please do better.
Please do better.
Dave Park's professional relationship with the band ended during the making of Adrenaline, but in their time together, so much of Deftones' collective identity was formed. Things that define them musically and explain some of the significant decisions they've made over the years, which Dave helped me understand before I let him go. Here, he talks about their relationship with Korn, nu metal, and their earliest inclinations to be authentic, and the name Deftones itself.
You would have thought from night one after the Dragonfly show that they would have been like, well, fuck those guys.
There was, fortunately at that point, even as the guys in the band were, discovering this sort of, animal organism, that they were becoming, there was still a lot of humility in that. And so when they came to recognize that, Korn was interpreting some of this, competitively, they were like, at first they were like, no, dude, you guys are insane. You kidding? Like, we're lucky to be here right now. And so, I think they've pretty quickly, mended, any kind of awkwardness there. And, there was a pretty fast, pretty deep and intense brotherhood that manifest
That's
in
really
all of
cool.
that.
That's really cool.
Did you want to talk about the bagpipes?
Did anybody in Deftones ever consider like, hey, maybe we should pick up a weird instrument?
No, I mean, it was all pretty organic, and even what I was seeing with, as I said earlier, it was all pretty organic what was happening with the guys from Korn, and the thing with the bagpipes and all that. It's like that was all like a little bit tongue in cheek, like they didn't really expect it to stick, but it wasn't it wasn't synthetic. It was all very, like, that was there already early in, an organic part of their set and part of their intro of like, this is how we come out and, sort of stand out a little bit, in the community.
But
So,
even with
it's very
those,
cool.
with the bagpipes, with them being a SoCal band, Deftones being a Northern California band. I mean, there probably wasn't 10% of difference early on. But it was probably Sacramento that facilitated their Deftones' ability to be different, right? To grow beyond, to expand that 10%, to separate themselves from, whatever new metal revolution that they might have helped open the door to, right?
Yeah, much to their chagrin. They're, I think, pretty ill at ease to be thought of in that way. And in those days, some of that hypersensitivity to being, to not sounding like anything else, and to, being air gapped creatively on as many fronts as possible. Some of that's born from the original sort of cycles of confidence as the band developed and found its legs, and like, yeah, we can do this. We don't have to borrow, or like the worst insult that they could ever get was, oh, hey, you guys sound like so and so, and it wouldn't even matter what band they got compared to. They didn't want to be compared to anybody. And before they, in those early developmental years, and you would hear, if you heard some of those first couple of demos, they were influenced by some of the like early Chili's, and there was this Bay Area funk thrash thing that was going on, and some of that was influential to them, and so there were elements of that were showing up in their early songs, but it was out of a sort of process to, just like you go to the mall and you try on 20 different pairs of shoes, but you only go home with, one or maybe two, unless you're my wife, in which case, all bets are off.
A few bags of shoes.
But there were a lot of bands that were happening around the Bay Area around that time: Fungo Mungo, Psychofuncopus, Limbo Maniacs, that were, very influential in that sort of funk thrash scene, who were, more, I think, closely comparable to, like early Chili's. In those days, more obviously influenced by, even though they each had their own sort of twist on it, the turn on it. I think, Deftones made a pretty conscious decision. It was like shedding their skin, like that was then, and this is now, and we're not doing that anymore. And so a lot of songs just naturally sort of fell off that had been influenced by that period, and some really catchy stuff. I mean, stuff like, there were songs early on that record companies were pointing to, like, that could go to radio.
Really?
But it was stuff that was, had been influenced by that sort of previous creative generation of the band, that they didn't self-identify as anymore. It's just like,
Sure.
I don't know if you do anything, like, you ever listen to your old demos,
Oh, sure. Early episodes of this podcast even are like, oh, what was I doing?
Like,
I did not have it figured out yet.
That was not my best day.
Yeah. Been there.
So yeah.
That's really, that's because I think sometime in the middle of 2020, maybe it was 21, there was a public access performance that came out. And John was on drums, Abe was not drumming. And it was all of those songs. It was all of those songs where they were very much the ska tones still.
Right.
Like, it was.
Oh yeah. No, there were a couple of songs, Answers, and
yes, Answers is
dude, and there are parts of Answers, like the second half, the outro from Answers, which, by the way, Stefan has a solo in, that gets very, I mean, it's a little shticky, in the verses, and Chino's doing this sort of reggae, sort of cadence, thing, but different from what I was originally hearing. And some people, just that song it was a little bit more cookie cutter, like straight, sort of reggae cadence. But the choruses, they sort of broke out and spread their wings a little bit. And then the back half of the song from the outro on, you wouldn't even recognize as being the same song. And it was much more, no pun intended, adrenaline filled, a band with real muscles that was, sort of, finding a bigger voice. And it's almost unfortunate because they had real writing chops. Like, one of the things that was evident to me, even as the band sort of went through these different chapters, creatively, is that at each stage, even if they weren't, even if they didn't have full control over it yet, that there were real songwriting skills that were evident even early on with the band. And you could have been forgiven in that moment to see them as, and you hear some of this in Answers, the 10% from Nirvana Nevermind, which was popping around that time. And a lot of people were thinking, obviously, what comes after this? What comes, and what are all the different flavors that people's now open minds are going to be open to? Mm-hmm. So there were, I think, the 10% rule probably was less in effect on the heels of Nirvana. People were probably more, even though I think that gets unfairly sort of cast as like a grunge era thing. There was a lot of other stuff that was happening musically that people's minds were more open to.
Right. Yeah. Hip hop was blowing up. New Jack was blowing up.
Right. Oh, do you even know where the name Deftones came from?
It's the Def Jam, right? It's Def Jam. It's
right. When Rick Rubin, when they went through all the ceremony of the funeral procession to bury the name, or to bury the Def, that Def was dead. That was the thing in Stefan's crawl. Like, the fuck it is, I'm going to name my band Def, and I'm going to use this. So that's, I don't know where, who shared that story before me, but that's, if you've heard that isn't mythology. That's true.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Nobody shared it on this podcast. No, I'm sure there's a more than a couple of Genesis, pardon the pun.
Yeah. I'm like, when I heard it, and like Rick Rubin was already like, massive. And I'm like, are you sure you want that to, like, are you sure this is what you want to go with? You can pick any like word or name or combination of words, whatever. Are you sure this is what you want to go with? And there were a lot of tones bands, that were happening around that time as well. A lot of ska bands who were, Flesh Tones and the
Boss Tones. Yeah,
exactly. So it's like, you're like, and we got that a lot when I was, doing outreach to expand our live audience, and I would be calling clubs or promoters or whoever. They'd be like, Deftones is a ska band. We got it constantly. We got put on shows with other ska bands because people were lazy and they just assumed, it must be another ska band. We had some very unusual, circumstances like that, but it was cool. It was like, sort of par for the course. And I think to some extent, the guys just sort of embraced it as it all goes in the soup. Like, this is all part of the thing, part of the process. One of the things I guess there will be a connecting thread here. One of the things that the band that Stefan and I used to work for before there was a Deftones, one of the things that band did organically, it wasn't by design. They played certain covers, that they just owned and played so well, so authentically, that like if you weren't familiar with the song, you wouldn't even know it was a cover. The band just inhabited, certain songs. And sometimes they'd like tongue in cheek and they would pick songs that like you would never expect. And so some of that bled into Deftones, and Stefan would tell the guys, because especially as they were like cycling songs out, like, okay, all of a sudden now you don't have enough songs. We got to do 60 minutes in Petaluma. We've only got a 45-minute set. What are we going to do? Oh, well, what's the weirdest fucking thing that we could do? All right, so we're going to close with Suicidal. We're going to do, and then they picked up on, I don't know if you know this already, but they used to cover The Joker, the Steve Miller song, and they crushed it, and it destroyed crowds. Like people wouldn't see it coming, and the band would like, and they're like, wait a second, are they? No. And the band would do like an honest version of The Joker. And it was an icebreaker. It was like one of the, your bags of tricks is if you're a band that's playing a market for the first time at a club, no one knows who the hell you are. You go in and you try to sell them on your own shit, and they're, they don't know what to make of you. You're like a 3-headed alien, and so you break out a song that they know, and it breaks the ice, and then, sort of warms the room to you. So that was sort of an old trick that the original band used to use to go break the ice, and whenever they play a new club, there were certain songs they could just pull out like arrows from their quiver and just say, all right, motherfucker, well, I guess we're gonna play some Bad Company. So some of that bled over into you've heard the guys do Duran Duran, and
I mean, so many things. I mean, they could put out a covers album and it would be,
right.
I mean, it would be hits.
You could probably think, and I don't know to a certainty that this would be the only point of influence or the only point of origin, but it was certainly, they had a front row seat to watching another band that was ahead of them, in the scene, and much bigger than them in the scene, who had used this sort of tactic successfully and organically. I mean, they weren't doing covers that they were cringing to play.
Right.
They picked songs that they loved genuinely and inhabited them and made them part of the thing. And I think some of that ended up in the DNA.
That's so cool. So often I have thought about, in my pursuit for to learn more about this band, that I've looked for or felt like there's got to be a watershed moment, or this particular thing had to lead to that. But I think it's a lot of things like what you're talking about as well. They were around this thing that was happening and that made sense. So why not give it a try? Or, often, like even when this conversation started and you were addressing how as a performer, Chino would have his back to the audience. And now, to think about Chino doing that is
unthinkable.
It's unthinkable. It is. It's silly.
People are going to think I made that up.
I mean, he's masterful. Like he is. It's a part of. It's something that I've discovered as doing this podcast. Part of my fandom. The live performance at Deftones show is as crucial to my experience as a fan as the actual recordings and those songs, as they exist on an album. The seeing them and that visceral experience is crucial. So to think about, them not being great, but obviously they weren't always great. It took time and it took moments, and I want to associate it to one leap, but like you said, it's lots of baby steps and lots of little things that get you there.
That's the natural human tendency to want to simplify things so they're they're easier. But I'm sure in many ways the story is no different from other bands who've gone through all the stuff, and it's a lot of little things and a lot of bad decisions that you have to own up to afterward, and having the the maturity to do that. And you don't always have that, and that's why I think a lot of ways where the break in our relationship came down is there were things that were happening and people in the band's ear that, I didn't have the maturity to counter that, and the band didn't have the maturity to filter it out. And there were things that were said and done that, in the moment when you're a stupid kid and your feelings are hurt, you act out. But I'm glad to say that, those melted, over time, because, whatever we went through together. We did it for the right reasons. And we're all still here. Well, all but one.
Listening to Dave Park talk about Deftones felt like watching a movie about Deftones. I think that might be the highest compliment I could pay a guest on this podcast. Thank you, Dave, for your time, for your stories, and for your generosity. Dave connected me with a couple other folks who will be joining me this season, including Brian McKenna from the legendary Cattle Club. Looking forward to sharing that with you soon. My name is Woody. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter. I'm at Woodbruh. If you want to talk about my favorite band, my DMs are open. Thank you for listening to Deftones, and thank you for listening to Change in the House of Pods.